I imagine it would be also important for the decision, for instance, of farmers or decision makers that also, as you said, might require a different type of modeling based maybe on agent based to better reflect the peculiarities with respect to a traditional performing approach. Thanks for waiting a bit longer for your presentation, and the floor is up to you.
Well, thanks a lot for having me here at this really interesting conference. My name is Verena Tiefenbeck. I'm a research associate at ETH Zurich at the Bits to Energy Lab, and where I spent 70% of my time. I'm also a postdoc at the University of Bonn at the Institute of Applied Microeconomics, where I spent the remaining 30% of my time, essentially. I'm going to talk about two field studies that we carried out in the past few years. One of them took place in Switzerland, the other one took place in Singapore. Both of them were with a similar intervention with these smart shower meters, but in a quite different context and with different research questions. But the overarching point that I'm trying to make, and that both studies actually show, is that real-time feedback, so information to consumers on their energy or water use that is given to them in real time and on a specific behavior, can induce really large behavior change, and that's what you're going to see in both of those studies. So maybe just a quick context on the Bits to Energy Lab, where we are and what we are and what we do. So we're actually a bunch of researchers mainly working from two different places, from ETH Zurich and from the University of Bamberg in Germany. And we are overall kind of an interdisciplinary team. So most of us have a technical background, like engineering, but we also have some psychologists or economists. And overall, our sort of mission is to combine information technology with insights from behavioral science to, well, create interventions in the field that have a real impact on energy use in particular, but also on water use. So I would like to have this in a bit of an interactive format. So whenever you have questions, really feel free to ask them, to interrupt me. If there's anything you don't understand, please ask. And I also have a couple of questions for you, actually. So the first being, how much water do you think the average shower uses? So this is for the people who don't work on shower data like David. So what do you think? How many liters or gallons do you use in the average shower? Any ideas on that? Just
per minute?
No, overall, like your typical shower.
50, 60.
50, 60?
50, 60 liters. Florence, maybe you are not for this data.
I said 40.
40? Yeah.
40.
But it's, yeah, I think.
Because that's the only people that probably know already these numbers.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Does anybody have any teenagers? Does anybody have any teenagers?
Yeah, I think all of that are good guesses. So the data that we collected show actually that it varies a lot by country. Like we did different studies in different countries, in Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Singapore, and you can see that Singapore, for instance, the per shower use is less than half or almost a third of what is being used in the Netherlands. The US data are not from our data set, but apparently in the US it's even higher than in the Netherlands, so it varies a lot by country.
The Dutch are tall.
Maybe. The other factor that it varies a lot by, and that's where your teenager comment is really spot on, is age. What we found in the Swiss sample, for instance, is that the younger people are, the more they use. Here the youngest group is actually between 20 and 29, so teenagers, which are supposedly the worst offenders, they're not even in there. And the young group here, they use 70% more water than the eldest generation. Now, if that's an age thing or a generation thing, we don't know for now. But I mean, at least in terms of, forecast, if that applies also to other countries, that might have quite some impact if consumption goes up. I mean, if it's a generation thing. The other thing that is kind of striking in the data that we have is how big the variance actually is. So if we compare the 10% of the most efficient shower takers and the 10% of the least efficient shower takers, there's a factor of 8 in the water consumption per shower. So it really depends a lot on behavior. It's not like you buy a fridge that is more or less efficient and then it's just running and you can barely influence it except for, not keeping the door open for hours. But I mean, in the shower, it's really all about behavior essentially. And that's why we decided to do something about it and to run some interventions that address the behavior. Now, the thing is, we ran the first study in Switzerland, and you could wonder, does it make any sense to run a water conservation study in Switzerland? Because, I mean, when you look outside, it's not necessarily a country that looks very, dry or water scarce. It's actually one of the countries that has the most abundant water resources. Same applies to Germany. Germans are very into water conservation, but there's a lot of newspaper articles that have been published recently that essentially say, well, it's sort of a national sport or a thing of personal virtue and social responsibility, but it actually doesn't make sense in Germany because the sewage system isn't made for that little throughput, and actually that causes problems like noxious gas and corrosion because, there is not enough going through the sewer. So the question is, why do we run studies anyways in Central Europe on that? Any ideas why we would put meters into people's showers then? Yeah?
There is energy as well?
Yeah. So there's energy as well. And unless you take cold showers, there's quite a bit of energy actually. So here's my next question for you. If we compare this to running your computer, like the energy that you use in 1 second of showering, what do you think how long you could power your MacBook with that, for instance? Is it roughly 4 seconds? Is it 40 seconds? Is it 30 minutes? Or is it an hour and a half? So maybe a quick poll, who thinks it's 4 seconds? 1? 42 seconds? 3 people?
Depends also on the original temperature of the water.
Average.
8:37.
So 12 and a half minutes for 1 second of showering. Okay, that's the vast majority. Any takers for an hour and a half? 3, 4? Yeah, so that's actually the correct answer. So I had trouble believing it, but 1 second of showering is enough to power a laptop like a MacBook Air for an hour and a half. So there's a lot of energy going into this. So it also makes sense in countries like Switzerland to reduce hot water consumption. When you look at European or US data, water heating is actually the second largest energy end use in homes. But there's a lot of attention that is put on appliances or on switching of lights and things like that. Water heating barely is in people's head when it comes to energy conservation. And so with people having in mind all those newspaper articles about water conservation doesn't make any sense, it's kind of hard actually to get across, no, it does make sense to conserve water, hot water, even in water-rich places like Switzerland. Yeah, and also the majority of hot water is being used in a shower. It's roughly 80% of that. So if you think about energy conservation from hot water, there is a single behavior that you can focus on. And also, this trend is gonna get more extreme in the future in the sense that as building codes become more and more stringent, and as insulation materials and windows become better and better, space heating actually, so that the share of space heating will actually go down, or is already going down, and water heating in passive houses or in low energy houses is being number one. So from an energy perspective, it makes really a lot of sense to cut your showers short. The other thing is that showering is one of those typical behaviors that people don't think about. It's not a very reflective process. It's, I mean, your daily routine, you get into the shower, you think of all sorts of things, but clearly not of energy conservation in most cases. And the other thing is that when you take your shower, I mean, the whole sensation of warm water on your skin, it's nice and cozy. It's much more salient than, you know, thinking about polar bears and all those things and the long-term impact. So we also have the salience bias that even people who care about the environment, they probably don't think that much about the environment in the shower. So, which also means it's an opportunity to start here. So what we did is we deployed these smart shower meters in a couple of hundred households, so roughly 700 households in Zurich in the first study. And the participants were customers of the local utility company. And they actually installed the device themselves, so it's for European showers, or I mean, most showers in the world actually are these handheld showers. I think the US are the major exception to that with the wall mount showers. But in all other showers, this device can actually be installed with just, in a minute or so, and all the participants did it on their own. I'm gonna pass this thing around you. Feel free to open it up. And so the device goes right next to the shower head, so you essentially have it at eye level, and you really see the information that's displayed. And so this device can display all sorts of information on, or status information on your current shower. So as soon as you turn on the water,
by the way, tomorrow morning I will bring 2 of these devices to be one that we communicate with your mobile phone. We can lend to a couple of participants, and then we get some feedback. And then we demonstrate it again on Wednesday afternoon during our public event.
Cool. So we still need volunteers to have their shower measured, I guess.
And maybe they can also store that sample you have.
This one doesn't communicate. It's still
okay, but you can still read the display.
Yes, so what the standard display displays is how much water you've been using since the start of your shower, how much energy you've been consuming. You also see the water temperature, the toggles here with energy use, and the toggles with an energy efficiency class. So every shower starts in energy efficiency class A, and then you move to B, C, depending on how long you take your shower. And connected to that is also this little polar bear animation, which may be controversial, maybe more controversial in some countries, but the participants of the study, they actually like it. Like 95% of them said, no, we really like it. And at least it's very sticky. People remember the polar bear.
What about a timer?
So far there's no timer. We've started running some experiments in hotels with a timer now, but don't have the data yet. But essentially that's the information that you see during each shower, and also that's the information that is being stored. So we have data on every single shower that is being taken with the devices. The device doesn't have a battery. It actually harvests its energy from the water flow, so you can use it for a pretty long time. Also the newer ones that can send data to your smartphone, it's powered by the water flow. Which is quite convenient that people don't have to replace the battery. So the first study was over 2 months, and we collected data from almost 47,000 showers from 630 households. Not all of them sent the device back. And the research questions that we're trying to answer in the first study mainly, or the high-level research question was, what impact does it have to have this kind of information in your shower, well, during the behavior, essentially. And the second question, we try to figure out, like, what are the mechanisms or what are the subgroups also that are particularly responsive to that kind of intervention. So we ran the study in a collaboration with several universities, so the University of Lausanne was also involved. And the study was funded by the Swiss Federal Office of Energy and also by Zurich's utility company, EVSIT. And the devices were manufactured by Ampiro, the spin-off company of ETH. Um, the participants were customers of the utility company, and we had to restrict our sample to 1 and 2 person households, because in the first study we were afraid that the memory of the devices wouldn't be large enough, because the devices store all the data, and at the end of the study we had to retrieve them. One interesting thing was that the same sample had also previously completed an electricity smart metering study. So you could say, yeah, how much selection bias do we have with people who complete 2 studies? But whatever selection bias we may or may not have, at least we have the same bias in both studies, and we can compare the outcomes of both studies. And we also can compare it with national representative data on environmental attitudes and all those things. And one of the interesting things was that our sample actually turned out to be less environmentally friendly than the average Swiss person, which was a surprise to us. But we think it's because our sample was slightly younger and more urban, and they, at least in Switzerland, tend to be less environmentally friendly than people living in the countryside.
And also, I think by choosing just 1 or 2 person household,
Yeah.
then the sample is biased, because as they were saying, you have no teenagers, like,
Yeah.
so there's something that maybe you
Yeah.
should
But that's where we come, so at least with the electricity smart metering study, we compared them with the 1 and 2 person households from that sample. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
So do you know how long winter?
In winter. Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, we have different studies now, different seasons, and yes, seasons do play a role, but yeah, we'll see. Yeah.
Also, just thinking on the results, when you have like several showers, consecutive showers,
Yeah.
because sometimes there's like some people living together, maybe
Yeah.
you open or close the faucet and then maybe you finish and there's somebody else coming after you. How do you deal with that kind of thing?
So
Just to
and
come for the
also,
shower.
when you switch off the water, just to, I don't know, put shampoo in your hair or so, the device does not switch off immediately. It goes on counting when you turn it on again. The cutoff is after 3 minutes. We thought that might be a reasonable, value, that before the next person takes a shower and the time you have completed, I don't know, shaving or whatever. Yeah. So there might be some issues with that. I mean, sometimes next person getting into the shower faster. But we asked a couple of questions in the survey, and it didn't seem to be a big problem. Also, we don't see a difference between 1 and 2 person households, like in terms of the number of showers they take. So we think it's not happening very often, actually.
Could it also, though, depend how close the hot water heater is to the shower? So, like, the farther away the heater is, the longer it takes for water at the right temperature to arrive for the person to effectively start showering, even though they
Maybe,
start.
yeah. Could be, yeah. But at least then that would be a household fixed effect that is stable. But yeah, but hopefully randomization with 700 participants will take care of that, hopefully. But yeah. So yeah, what we did was we ran this randomized controlled trial that essentially at the beginning, for the first 10 showers, all participants only saw water temperature on the display. The idea was we wanted to know how they are behaving before they get feedback. And the devices display water temperature because it doesn't give away anything about your consumption, but you see that the device is on, it's measuring, it's working, so you know that your behavior is being monitored, essentially. And that was the same for everybody. And after the 10th shower, the intervention phase started, where 2/3 of the households now got this feedback, so water use, energy use, and all the things that were on the previous slide. Whereas 1/3 of the households still continue to see water temperature only throughout the entire study. And both before and after the study, we asked survey questions to figure out people's environmental attitudes, personality, income, all sorts of things. What you see on this slide is essentially on the x-axis the energy used per shower in kilowatt hours. And the blue line that you see here is essentially the average of the control group. So you can see that the control group during the baseline phase here used roughly 2.6 kilowatt hours per shower. As the study continued, well, they couldn't see anything else than water temperature, so they didn't change the behavior that much. Actually, there's a slight increase in their energy use per shower, and I will come back to that point later. Now, when we look at the treatment group, you can see that during the baseline phase, when they also only saw water temperature, their behavior was the same. There's no difference between the two groups. But then, as soon as we started the feedback in the 11th shower, you could see that the consumption drops dramatically, and it drops from the very first shower that people see feedback in. And when you look at the gap between those two lines, you may also infer visually that, well, the gap isn't becoming smaller. So during the 2 months, at least, that behavior, the reduction seems to be sustained. I mean, that's just a visual impression. We also calculated the whole thing, how time influences it, and there is no reduction in the savings over those 2 months. Now, you can obviously ask yourself, 2 months, what happens after? So we also ran some longer studies. The one in Singapore, for instance, was between 4 and 6 months. And also there, we don't find any reduction in the treatment effect. So, and I mean, after 4 months of daily training of a behavior, I assume it's sort of, well, it's not that weird to assume that people have developed a new habit and are gonna keep up sustaining that new habit of lower consumption. Yeah, that is the chart for energy use. I could basically just replace the y-axis with water use, and the curve would almost look the same because, well, energy and water use are very highly correlated since nobody is taking colder showers. And I mean, essentially, energy use is calculated based on a product of water use times the temperature gradient times the heat capacity times the, well, eta, so the heat coefficient, depending on the water heating system people have in their homes, if it's gas, if it's electric, or if it's oil. One question that we were interested in was, how do people actually reduce their energy use? Like, what do they do? Do they take colder showers? And the answer seems to be that they may need to cut their shower short. So the average shower here in the baseline phase lasted roughly 4 to 5 minutes, and actually people cut their shower short by almost a minute. So almost all the savings come from shorter showers. They do not really or barely reduce the flow rate, they barely reduce the temperature, they barely take, well, interrupt the shower more often. I mean, they will do all of that, but I mean, the big thing, the big driver of the savings is really shorter showers, period. One thing we also wanted to know was, do people actually learn, or how well informed are people about their water use or energy use in the shower? And so, in the survey before the study, we asked them how much water, just as I asked you now, how much water do you think you use per shower? And you can see in this really messy diagram that's, well, on the x-axis it's actual water use in that household, and this is estimated water use. So if you're spot on, you should be here on this 45-degree line, and people are just all over the place, essentially. So people have no idea how much water they're using before the study. And we see that after the study, this is still the case for the control group. They're still kind of clueless, whereas the two treatment groups, apparently they've learned quite well how much they've been using. So you could say, yeah, well, you saw it every day in the shower, surprise, surprise. But the thing is, there's a couple of studies with O-power, for instance, so in the electricity sector, or also on water consumption, where people get information on their aggregated household use, and people don't learn there how much they've been using, actually. Whereas here, in this behavior-specific seem really to, process the information. Let's skip that. So I think one of the things that surprised us was that the effect was really immediate, that it doesn't seem to be a question of repetition, that it was stable, and for the economists among you, we put that into a model actually, but for the non-economists among you, don't worry about the group measures. So yeah, and overall we found a 22% reduction in the energy use and also the water use for the target behavior of showering. You may say, well, 22%, but it's only 22% of showering. The thing is, if you calculate what that means per year, it's 452 kilowatt hours per year for the average 2.1 person household. So that's a lot. It's actually more what they use for lighting on a yearly basis. So the savings exceed the energy of use of lighting in a typical Swiss household. When we compare that now with electricity smart metering, where people get feedback on their household's electricity use, their conservation effect is typically between 2 and 5%. And in our sample, whether they had also gone through an electricity smart metering study, they had only reduced the consumption by 86 kilowatt hours of electric energy, which is much smaller than the savings that they achieved here in the focus on a single behavior. So we really think that focusing on one behavior and getting the information during the action while you can still do something about it is much more effective than some aggregated data that you probably don't take a look at while you're cooking or while you're actually consuming an energy. That's a recap of that. Basically, so in the smart metering study on electricity, they reduced the consumption by 3% roughly, but 3% of their electricity use, which is not only much less in terms of energy use, but also much less in terms of CO2 reduction. I mean, factor of 11 is extreme here. That's because in Switzerland, the electricity mix is very clean, whereas water heating is still quite fossil heavy, much more based on gas and oil than the Swiss electricity mix, which is based essentially on hydro and on nuclear power. But then we also have water conservation as a byproduct in Switzerland, and the money savings are also much bigger with the smart shower meters than with the electricity smart meters. So when we look at cost effectiveness of the intervention, we see that the intervention is actually very cost effective. If we look at it from a household's perspective, the device pays off within 9 or 10 months, which is quite short, I think, because they save both on their energy bill and on their water bill. When we look at it from a policymaker perspective, I mean, the policymaker does not read the savings on households' energy and water use. So for them, it's a question of how high are the carbon abatement costs. And if we look at kilowatt hours, so just the cost side, then the kilowatt hour of energy, of heat energy abated costs 2.9 cents, which is really not much. If we compare this, as Alfred and Nathan, for instance, do that against the marginal cost of energy production and assume the same value of 8 cents per kilowatt hour, we actually end up with negative carbon abatement costs. So you actually make money having that intervention. That slide looks a bit scary at first, but what we wanted to find out was who actually saves. Are there certain subgroups that save more energy and water than others? And what you see here first is the constant. So again, that's only the subset of people that filled out the survey, which was the vast majority, but not all of them, which is why here the value is slightly smaller than the 2.55 that we had before. And so this is essentially how much energy is in kilowatt hours is being used per shower. And you see that the treatment effect, so those 22% here are reflected here. So the people who had the device, who were in the treatment group, they had a consumption that was 0.6 kilowatt hours lower. Now, the other main predictor for savings is baseline use. So that if your baseline is 1 kilowatt hour higher, your reduction is going to be 0.3 kilowatt hours higher. So basically, baseline use is really the best predictor of people's impact on conservation. So if you have to decide which households you're going to give these devices out to, it's definitely the ones who are high users where you're going to have the biggest effects. And now when you think of the countries, and when you think of Singapore, for instance, where people start out with 20 liters, there isn't that much that you can do compared to the US or to the Netherlands, where people start out with 50, 60, 70 liters. Interestingly enough, environmental attitudes also play quite a big role, but much less than baseline consumption. People who like quantifying, so people who are into numbers, it also works better on them apparently. Whereas things like gender, age, income doesn't seem to matter. We also looked at personality traits, and the only one that at least was marginally significant was conscientiousness, but not the way we had expected it. Actually, the less conscientious reduce the consumption more. We think that maybe that's the ones who are conscientious in the first place, they don't need the device as much, and the ones who don't care as much, maybe it helps them more. Not care as much, but who have a bigger problem being conscientious in their daily life. Interestingly enough, emotionality doesn't play a role. We had assumed that maybe the device might build up some psychological pressure to reduce their consumption, and in that case we should see people who are susceptible to pressure, which is this personality trait, should have bigger savings, but that was not the case. So
how did you actually measure that?
Whether
someone's emotional or not?
That's the Hexaco, so it's a standardized survey with 60 questions. It's similar to the Big Five, but it has 6 traits in terms of 5 instead of 5. I mean, it's a survey measure, not perfect, but at least it's a validated instrument. Yeah, but I mean, I think the key thing here is really that baseline is the one biggest driver of consumption, of savings, sorry. Yeah, when I talk about results, it's all nice and so on. One thing that I didn't mention was how we gather the data. And that's where you can see from the picture that it's kind of a messy and quite of a cumbersome process, because at least in the first studies, the devices couldn't send the data yet. And so we actually had to ask participants to ship the device back to us, then we read it out, and then we shipped it back. So there was, you can see on the picture, there was quite some logistics involved. And when in here, 700 devices, doesn't sound as much, but when you have to read 700 devices out, it's a nightmare. So luckily we had a bunch of people helping with it. The readout process, another cumbersome process. We actually had to put each device into a readout terminal, which was then read out optically, so the device would flash images and then create a CSV file, and then we had to link to the survey data. So yeah, in reality it took a while to collect those data. And luckily the new ones now, they can just send the data to participants' smartphone and we get them the data from the server. So the article now on this first studies is finally coming out this year in Management Science, so we're super happy now that finally it's accepted. It took quite a while, not only because of the logistics, but also because we were running other studies in parallel, and when you run studies, they always have priority over the paper which actually you care more about. But well, it took quite a while, but now finally it's gonna come out, and I'm happy to send it to you also now, just ask me if you're interested. Now, we were very happy actually with this huge treatment effect of 22%, which also allows us then to disentangle what's behind it, what are the mechanisms, and the idea that we water and things like that. So since then we started running a couple of studies in different countries, each of them with a different research question. So the main idea was not, okay, let's see if we can replicate this in Korea as well. The idea was more that each study is different and has a different research question. And I'm going to present the key results of the study that we ran in Singapore last year with 900 devices. Well, Singapore is very different from Switzerland in the sense that it's a really water-stressed country. I mean, they barely have any land mass, so they rely a lot on Malaysia and importing water from Malaysia, which of course policy dependence, which is not a very pleasant thing, I guess. And also, the authorities expect that Singapore's water use is going to double by 2060. So that, in addition to this high dependence on Malaysia, Singapore really has interest in reducing per capita consumption. And they now put out a long-term roadmap of how they're going to address these things. And actually the idea is to diversify water supply. So they are using increasingly also desalination plants and treated water to reduce and to become more and more self-sufficient in their water consumption. But also they try to work on the demand side, and actually they have been working quite heavily on the demand side. When you look at the daily per capita use, it has already gone down quite a lot, from 165 liters per day to 150 liters per day. And the goal is to further reduce it by 4 liters by 2020 and 140 liters by 2030. Now that means for us that it's a much tougher ground actually to run the study, because as I said, our reductions are mainly driven by baseline use, and if the shower use is 20 liters, well, there isn't that much that you can cut out of your shower compared to the Swiss study. So we were curious how, and if at all, the device would also work in this setting where people are also already very aware of, water being a scarce resource. So in that project, we collaborated also with the National University of Singapore as a local partner, and with the Public Utilities Board of Singapore, who financed the devices. What we tried to find out, well, can we replicate it in this different context, but essentially we tried to find out to what extent exogenously imposed goals can affect behavior. So in other words, participants, some groups, they got a goal, a conservation goal. You should not exceed X liters. And we wanted to find out to what extent that actually affects their behavior in the long run. Because a lot of the goal-setting studies, they're just one-shots in the lab, one day. And we wanted to figure out, do goals really affect behavior in the long run as well? And we wanted to find out if we also find some evidence of spillover effects. Now, when I said that the logistics in the Swiss study were serious, this is a different level, because the Public Utilities Board really cared about having a representative sample. So they wanted to make sure that all ethnic groups are represented, that high income, low income really is representative of the Singaporean population. And essentially, NUS hired 10 research assistants who went around the city and knocked on doors. So it's not as much of an opt-in sample, but essentially they went to people's doors saying, the government has selected you, you get a smart device for free, here it is, may I install it, and ask you some survey questions. So here's some pictures of that. These are the research assistants who ran around in university t-shirts, and some of the participants. And also they had to collect the devices back at the end of the study, so there was really a lot of logistics involved in that one. Now that's the research design of the study. So we had again a control group. So during the baseline phase, all groups only saw water temperature, same thing as in the first study. And during the intervention, again the control group, water temperature only. Then we had a real-time feedback group, so they got feedback. They could see how much water they've been using since the beginning of the shower, but that was all. They didn't see the polar bear, no they, at the beginning of the shower, they saw this display for 20 seconds that stated goal max 20 liters. So the upper part would toggle between goal and max so that you would remember it. And then the device started counting, or well, after 20 seconds it started to, display water consumption. And they saw the current water consumption. They also saw the polar bear. In this case, they didn't see it anymore because they were beyond the goal. And so it started with very good, then went to okay, and then went to too much. So, yeah. So basically, this message was tagged to let go in all of those 5 groups. Now, the data set in Singapore is huge. First of all, because the families are larger, and also because they take twice as many showers. It's much less volume per shower, but then they take twice as many showers. And if you've ever been to Singapore and have sensed the humidity and the heat, you know why people take that many showers. But also the study was going on for between 4 and 6 months. So it's a huge data set. And essentially what we find is, again, in the control group, we have this increase in consumption, which in Singapore has quite of a stable climate. So we don't think that this has anything to do with seasonal factors. And we find this pattern in every single study. We actually think that it's Hawthorne effects, that at the beginning of the study, all participants think, oh, I'm being monitored, and after a while they get used to it, they don't care anymore, they forget about it, and the behavior seems to converge more, to saturate more to what is probably their normal behavior when they're not being monitored. That's what we gather, at least. Now, when we look at the group that saw real-time feedback on their water use, you see that it works again. So we see a clear reduction in consumption, and obviously the difference here between 21 liters and 19 liters is not as big as in Switzerland, but again, smaller baseline, no surprise, still a very clear difference. And now when we add the goals, the people who had goals, they reduced it by much more. But these are all the 5 goal groups bundled together. Now, when we look at the goal groups individually, well, first of all, that's what the control group did. So that's a change against the baseline. So here's 0. So essentially, the control group, they increased their water use per shower. The real-time feedback group, they reduced their water use per shower by 2.2 liters. And here's the different goal groups. And you can see that, well, the people had a very non-ambitious goal of 35 liters, which is way beyond the 20-liter average. Well, they didn't do that well. Whereas the ones who had very ambitious goals, they did, or who had reasonable goals, let's say 15 liters in particular, they did much better. And we can really see that depending how far your baseline was, they did much better. Yeah.
If you go back to the previous slide, I think the previous one, I think that you can observe the same effect that you have in the control group, that the groups with goal, they try their best at the beginning, and then they have to relax because they sustain such an aggressive reduction of the water covering time.
So we're still in the process of exploring that more in detail, but yes, I think you're right that especially the ones who had too ambitious goals, like 10 liters, that after a while they may have given up.
I'm also observing in all the graph, maybe this is something visual, but it seems that they all have a positive slope.
Yeah.
So maybe the blue ones, they arrive to their normal behavior sooner once you have installed the device. But then for the real-time feedback and real-time feedback with goals, maybe it takes more time, but if it continues with the positive slope, at one point, like the effect of the device will be lost. I don't know, because you are talking about 6 months or something like that.
Yeah.
So, but still, because it's the same as the other study, maybe something visual, but I can see something positive slope.
But the thing is that the difference between the groups,
Yeah,
that's
but maybe that difference in a longer period of time the blue will stabilize with the normal behavior, and at some point the other will reach that. Maybe not in 6 months, but in maybe 1 year, 1.5 years, I don't know. Is there something?
Could be, yeah. Actually, we measured household water use also after we had taken the devices out, and we see that even after taking the devices out, there is still an effect that lasts on consumption. But the data is less granular since it's only household level data in that case. But yeah, I think it's really one of the big questions, like what's actually going on here with this hawthorn or whatever behavior.
Need to compare these curves with the weather conditions.
Sorry?
Need to compare these curves with the weather conditions because humidity in this tool is mainly positives.
Yeah. We did. So we did in Switzerland, and there was no correlation. Here in Singapore, the weather, I mean, it's close to the equator, so there aren't such extreme temperature swings. And we see really the control group behavior no matter what season we run a study at, no matter which country, we always see this upward slope. So I think it's probably something that might affect a lot of studies. Yeah.
I was wondering if you did some of the psychological profiling of the respondents in this case, because you have so many more to see if within each of these groups you might have some groups that stayed low, some groups that ignored it, some that...
So in Singapore we collected demographic data, we collected environmental attitudes and so on, but not the psychological profiles. One reason being that households in Singapore are much bigger, so usually 3 or 4 people share a shower. And so we would need to collect everybody's profile, whereas in Switzerland with 1 or 2 people that was possible. So in Singapore we did not. Yeah.
So maybe that's the reason why they take short showers. There's someone waiting for the shower.
Get out!
Why does the control group go way up, right, when nothing's changing for them, but for the other groups, that the display information you're seeing?
That's one thing that we hate about this data set. I think it's a visual artifact. Like when you look at the data, the jump does not seem like when we run the regressions, it's not such a big jump. But here in the, I mean, when you look at that, the spike. I mean, when you look at it, there's several spikes like that are kind of up or down. And this one just happens to coincide with the baseline, which is unfortunate.
So the baseline period just isn't long enough? Would that be?
In this case, it's even 20 showers. It's longer than in Switzerland because we had more family members and they took more showers, but maybe we should have done 40 showers.
Meaning they haven't habitualized to just having the device in the...
But, I mean, that's the control group. For them, nothing changed from baseline to intervention. So water temperature only all the time. So no change for them. I think it's just a bad coincidence of, the spike coinciding here with end of baseline.
What you said before, that at the beginning they had the device and they knew they were monitored, so they tried maybe subconsciously to reduce their consumption, and then after a while they forgot even more.
I mean, that overall it goes up, that is exactly that, but I mean, it looks really as if right, when the baseline ended. But I think that's an artifact more than anything else. Yeah?
That's a question, sorry. So how reliable do you think is the flow sensor? Because at the end, I mean, all this data depends on how reliable is the flow sensor. I don't know what type of sensor, if you are going to be like press a difference sensor, is a mechanical meter, or is something inside, I don't know, because if it's something like a turbine, that, I mean, it can be affected by like 6 months, because I don't know how, I know, I work in the water meter center, and I know how difficult it is to design a water meter. So if it's, I don't know what kind of sensor you are using, but that's something that you should consider, especially if you run a very long study for 1 year. I mean, starting from scratch to build a sensor that stays stable on time is difficult. So something maybe.
But often that they usually underread with time?
Well, it depends. At low flows they do, but medium and high flows they don't. But Maybe we can talk about that.
This one measures rotational speed of the turbine.
Okay.
It's actually something that we could look into, yes, if there's some, if that could explain the time trend. It could be an answer. That's a good point, yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Did you test them at the end? Like calibrate them at the beginning and then calibrate them at the end?
We did not, actually we should, yeah.
Well, if you have them back, you can calibrate them.
Yeah, definitely.
We are talking about 10% difference,
Yeah.
and sometimes I test a lot of meters,
Yeah.
and sometimes with a good quality meter,
Yeah.
after 2 years, it's like 5% different from when it started. So.
Yeah.
And that's a very well designed meter, specifically
Yeah.
designed with a lot of experience.
So that's a very good point. I think I'm going to definitely take that home. I mean, probably the engineer who worked on it could tell more, but I think we never really measured devices before and after the study, like calibration devices. So yeah, I think the thing in the Singapore study is that given that they take more than 1 shower per day, we actually achieve a conservation effect of 5 liters per day per person, which, if you remember, the conservation targets issued by the Public Utilities Board, it was reducing consumption by 4 liters per person per day. So we actually exceeded with the shower intervention, which, well, hopefully now I don't know, maybe they think now about scaling it up. We have to see. The interesting thing is if you segment participants and if you would focus on the top quartile of participants, then the conservation effect is even 10 liters a day. And I mean, it's based on age and so on, you can actually identify high users quite easily. It's very similar to very large price increases having this reduction. And I think the key point is that even in places where people are already very aware and very sensibilized for their water consumption, that kind of feedback still seems to make a difference. So I think time's up almost, but I'm also at the last slide, so wrap up. So we run a series of studies, and I presented 2 of them, one that took place in Switzerland over 2 months, and one in Singapore was over between 4 and 6 months with 900 devices and 550 households. So Singapore, they all have 2 showers almost, and so we had more than 1 device per household, whereas in Switzerland it was 1 device per household. We see that this kind of real-time feedback on a specific behavior can really make a big change to people's behavior. The effects seem to be stable, at least we have no evidence of decline so far. The effects are large also in absolute terms, so in Switzerland it's more than the household's energy used for lighting. And it's much bigger impact than when you focus on households' aggregated resource consumption. And in Singapore we see that conservation goals can really still increase the impact of this kind of intervention, especially when the goals are, well, reasonably chosen, not too ambitious, not too soft, but I mean pretty close to the baseline. And that's it, and I'm very happy if you have more questions afterwards. And thanks for all the great questions and comments.
This is really neat. First question I have is related to, were there noticeable differences on a per person basis between the households that only had 1 person and the households that had 2 people? Meaning, were there some economies of scale of having multiple people in the house showering?
So on the use per shower, there was no difference. Hopefully, this slide is skipped. But obviously, I mean, if the more people you have, the more showers you have that you can save on. So a 3-person household saves more than a 1-person household, but just because there's more showers. But there's no difference in the conservation effect between 1 and 2-person households.
Other question. The survey was for the households, right? But the device is measuring individual behavior.
Yeah.
doing all the conserving in
Yeah.
the house versus the other
So-
person who's just completely ignoring it, or
So the only way that we could really say this shower was caused by person X and that by person Y would be installing webcams. And I think our participants wouldn't be too happy. I mean, in theory, there's other ways. You could ask people to write a diary, but that kind of thing, it
Can you
never
have a
seems
thumbprint?
to.
but just with the data itself, you have the temperature, the
Yeah.
time, the water
Yeah.
use. Do they
Yeah,
cluster?
see if you
do
can do
they-
a clustering
do those
analysis.
cluster
We
out?
looked into that. The thing is that differences seem to be too small, or rather, the differences between also individual shower, like the variance is too
Uh-huh.
big.
Uh-huh.
You don't see the impact of a second person. There's
Okay.
essentially no difference because when you just look at women, one day they wash their hair, the other day they don't. That's a much bigger difference than
Mhm.
her versus him.
And I might bring a personal experience because I have one of these devices at home and with my wife. Actually, when we started to use it, I told her, I need 8 liters. And then she did, I need 8 liters too. So since you interact, you try to converge to the same value. So it's always difficult to distinguish.
That was actually one thing we were looking for. So I just said in the first study, the treatment group. For real, we had 2 treatment groups, and one of them saw the previous person's or shower consumption, and the other one did not. And that's where we thought between 1 and 2 person households, we might see differences, but that's a slide that I skipped. But none of that actually made a difference. So I'm just going back to that slide. Yeah, so oops. So that's between 1 and 2 person households and between the ones who saw consumption, water consumption in previous shower and the ones who did not. I mean, they all behave the same statistically. So unfortunately, we were expecting that people would start competing, but nah,
Really.
not enough.